Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this international webinar convened by South Asia Research Institute for Minorities. Today's discussion on human rights for religious minorities in South Asia, I also would say, and beyond. And that webinar aligns directly with the global significance of Human Rights Day, which is normally observed on December 10th to commemorate the adoption of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is UDHR of 1948. Human Rights Day is not a symbolic, it's a reminder that rights are obligations. It exposes the gap between formal communication and lived realities, specifically for communities that sit at the margin of political and social power. For religious minorities across South Asia and beyond, I would say this day underscore that equality, dignity, and protection are not privileges. They are non-negotiable entitlements under the international law. Why Human Rights Day matter? The UDHR sits on three principles, which is universality. That means all individuals, irrespective of religion or identity, I would say political affiliation, possess inherent rights. Non-discrimination, which indicates that no state can justify the distinction that erode minority protection. And also accountability, that governments bear the responsibility to prevent violations and ensure the protection and justice served for the persevered ones. Religious minorities experiences firsthand what happens when these principles are ignored: social exclusion, legal vulnerability, and uneven access to justice erode. So without further ado, I would also link today's webinar to South Asia's reality, which embodies a paradox. It is a region, South Asia is a region with tradition of pluralism, yet persistent patterns of marginalization. Protection mechanism exist, but implementation is inconsistent and questionable as well. Political majoritarianism is on the high, that often overshadows constitutional guarantees, placing minorities at heightened risk. Democratic backslide is on the verge. This webinar, therefore, serves not as a critique for its own sake, but it's as an intellectual intervention of refined legal framework to strengthen institution and foreground minority experiences within a policy discourse. So without further ado, my name is Furqan, and I have an absolute honor to moderate this session. And we have the company of illustrious panelists with us. To begin with, I would request Dr. Fernand De Varennes for his keynote speech. Dr. De Varennes has previously served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. His work centers on the human rights of minorities, prevention of ethnic conflict, migrant rights, and the role of autonomy and federalism in managing cultural diversity. He's also a globally recognized expert. He has taught across all over the world, mainly in South Africa, Asia, Europe, and Australia, including nearly 2 decades at Murdoch University. Correct me if I'm misplacing your affiliations. And he also produced more than 250 publications in more than 30 languages. So Dr. De Varennes, over to you. And we also have the company of Professor Shai, who is full-time geopolitical professor of law at the University of Maranhão and the Higher Education of Public Prosecutions Office at Maranhão. He also holds advanced degrees in constitutional and public law, including a doctorate from Federal University in Minas Gerais and Coroboso School of Law, as well as postdoctoral studies at University of Salamanca and Central European Universities. He's also a colleague of mine. I also have learned and earned so many things from him while we discuss many topics at the Research Committee of Human Rights of International Political Science Association. Last but not the least, we have Dr. Vikrant Kishore, who is also an academician who has been connected with, Dr. Vikrant Kishore is an academic, filmmaker, photographer, author, and journalist. He has more than 30 documentaries, web series, and corporate films to his credit. He has been actively working for the safeguard and preservation of the cultural heritage of East India, especially in Jahu dance, right? Dr. Kishore is an active member of International Dance Council designated at UNESCO, and Association National Culture and Tradition, which is ANCT in France. He is also a convener of the Intangible Cultural Heritage Research Network, which is ICHRN, in collaboration with the World Festivals at Guimarães. So I think I've taken over a lot of time, so I would not waste most of your time. I welcome those who are watching this webinar, so I would hand over the mic to our keynote speaker, Dr. Fernand, to start proceedings. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very, very much, Furqan. Greetings, everyone. Greetings all the way from Eastern Canada, where I can guarantee you the weather is the exact opposite from what you have in Pakistan, Australia, and Brazil. Many thanks also, of course, to the South Asia Research Institute for Minorities for the honor and the privilege of being able to contribute online today. I'm delighted to be part of this panel and to be with quite a few distinguished members, particularly, I have to say, Professor Cássius, whom I last saw in Brazil. Bom dia. Why are we talking about protection, inclusion, and justice, and combining this with the human rights of religious minorities? Well, Furqan, in fact, already mentioned some of the basic aspects involved, but I would just like to mention or focus on two reasons. First, because human rights are the necessary preconditions for religious minorities and others to be assured of protection, inclusion in society, and to actually have equal justice, equal access, and practical justice. That's the first point. Secondly, because right now, religious minorities in South Asia and other parts of the world are seeing some of the most difficult periods in recent history. We're seeing massive denial of their human rights, increasing exclusion, and injustice. And let's be blunt about this, but clear. As you know, of course, better than I, we're seeing atrocities committed against young women and girls from religious minorities in countries such as Pakistan and India and others. Millions of religious minorities in India, mainly Muslims, are at risk of being denied citizenship. Hate speech has reached record levels, in fact, in many countries of the region. And this is targeted hate speech that is mainly targeting religious and other minorities. And what we're seeing, which is also a relatively recent development, or let's say in the last 10 or 20 years, we're seeing legislation, which is more and more in place, which limit truly the human rights of religious minorities in areas of work, type of economic activities, marriages, and a number of other aspects. And once again, most of you know many more situations what we have in South Asia. Now, everything that I have mentioned are injustices, yes, in a general way. They are forms of exclusion, quite often, and in the end, they involve the failure of government authorities to protect everyone equally, and especially religious minorities. And as you know, of course, once again, better than I, perhaps the most pressing challenge that religious minorities in South Asia face is that a lot of the, to be diplomatic, inaction, and to be less diplomatic, refusal by authorities to protect religious minorities is not accidental. It is, not in all cases, but in many cases, a matter where the government themselves, because of the surrounding environment, the context, and to be very clear, the rise of majoritarian religious-tinted nationalism in many countries in South Asia and elsewhere, that we are now seeing situations that lead to governments pandering to their majority supporters and perhaps a growing environment of religious intolerance and action that is connected to this. In a sense, it is for these kinds of challenges for which international human rights mechanisms, well, first the laws and standard, but also the mechanisms for the implementation of these universal human rights have evolved at the United Nations. And they involve human rights obligations. In fact, we should say even international legal obligations, such as freedom of religion or belief, but also the prohibition of discrimination and other rights, such as quite often even for religious minorities, freedom of association can be involved, freedom of expression, even the right to family life. Now, all of these provide protections. Protections to ensure that religious minorities are obviously protected fully and equally, that they are included in society equally, and that they receive justice in the hands of their governments equally. Quite often, when we talk about some of the situations, many of massive violations of human rights in South Asian countries, it may not always be a violation of freedom of religion itself. Very often, what you have are discriminatory practices that impact or target members of religious minorities in particular. And if there are governments, and if you have governments failing in these obligations, these human rights, international legal obligations, then members of religious minorities have mechanisms that they can use to try to get international attention and response. And I think this is where we need to talk about, and I'd like to spend a few minutes, because as Furqan also mentioned at one point, implementation is becoming the big issue, the big challenge, perhaps the biggest challenge you have. There are laws in, I would venture, in all of the countries in South Asia that on their face, actually provide a great deal of human rights protection. But their implementation, or their refusal in some cases to implement them fully, is in fact what is leading to massive violations of human rights in a context almost of impunity for the authors of these human rights. Now, the United Nations in particular has developed a large number of human rights to address, if you will, the absence of implementation at the national level of the country's human rights obligations. But let's be honest, the United Nations and these mechanisms cannot force a government to comply, except maybe in the worst situations such as genocide, where there are stronger mechanisms. But as we're seeing in Gaza, even then, these international human rights obligations don't necessarily work, even in the most serious of situations. But yet, freedom of religion or belief, especially for minorities, and I would add to that, I would not separate discrimination on the ground of religion or belief at the same time. But specifically, when we talk about religious minorities and their freedom of religion or belief, this is one area where there is, in fact, some possibilities of mechanisms, approaches, and efforts that you may have that is much more numerous than would happen in other areas of human practices. But before I briefly outline these, I think there needs to be a strategic approach adopted. And I want to bring this up because one has to be realistic. Organizations, research or activist organizations cannot do everything everywhere at the same time. You don't have the resources. And if you are looking at not only better understanding, but better implementation of the rights of religious minorities in South Asia, then there has to be a strategic approach adopted as to what you wish to accomplish, which areas you wish to prioritize over a period of time, and what resources you're willing and able to put aside for these purposes. Is it to try to lobby your own government to obtain policy changes, to correct a restricted number, or to try to address a specific number of cases of violations of the rights of religious minorities? Is it to raise awareness and visibility outside of your country, especially in international or human rights fora, in the hope that this might pressure, even perhaps shame and embarrass governments enough for them to take some kind of action to address particularly serious human rights violation? Is it even perhaps to try to have an influence on a government to get involved and to be more involved, and through diplomatic and political channels try to obtain reforms that are needed for the better protection, inclusion, and justice for religious minorities? And I come back to the original point, trying to do everything at the same time will simply not work. It will in the end, and probably be too thin and spread out to have any significant impact. So you have to strategize, prioritize, and devise a plan of action which is honest about your resources and manpower, and willing to project over a number of years, because nothing will occur overnight. Now, from a human rights point of view, there are many significant mechanisms which may be able, which are available to you for concrete areas of human rights violations where you wish specific issues to be addressed and perhaps actual victims, their causes to be highlighted. You could obviously go directly with a complaint with the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the Convention on the, and this may be surprising initially, the Convention on the Prohibition of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Many religious minorities in South Asia could also be considered to be at the same time ethnic minorities. Not all, but quite a few actually. And therefore, they would fall under the category of race. And the Race Discrimination Convention is a process that is available in that case. Both of these, when you go try to obtain a treaty redress for specific situations, they are extremely long. It takes a long time, usually, unless it's an extremely urgent matter. There are a lot of requirements also, including exhausting domestic remedies. Not for everyone, nor every situation. You could also, when your country is subject to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review. The United Nations, the Human Rights Council, has every, I forget, 4 or 5 years, a report which each country essentially has to present for a review, the UP, the Universal Periodic Review, of how well or not well they're doing in various areas of their human rights obligations. There you could present a shadow report, which could be picked up and lead to recommendations, which have a stronger political weight and attention, because it is done at a fairly high level at the United Nations Human Rights Council, which have a stronger political weight and attention because they involve other governments, countries. These are countries that actually review how a separate country is doing in terms of human rights obligations. And because we're talking about government representatives, and by the way, this is faster than having a complaint presented under one of the treaties, which can take many years. It is faster, more high level, diplomatic level, quite frankly, but it is very political. And sometimes the recommendations are, well, perhaps too vague, general, or again, simply easily ignored. But you can get more international attention and awareness by being present in a report and attending sessions of the UPR. There are, of course, special procedures, usually special rapporteurs, such as the one on freedom of religion or belief, and of course, my own mandate on minorities. You can actually much more easily and immediately present complaints or large reports of large violations of human rights to a special rapporteur. And this can be dealt with almost immediately, as a matter of fact, especially if it seems important, without really any technical requirements ahead of time. In fact, other special rapporteurs can join. So even though it may be a matter of a religious minority, for example, if you are raising an issue, a situation involving the rights of young women and girls from religious minorities, then very likely the special rapporteur on violence against women would be part of this process. So you can have issues where a number of special rapporteurs will look at the complaint, examine it, the validity of it, and make recommendations, but also they can issue a press release on the matter and therefore attract a huge amount of global attention and awareness. And this can actually increase, quite frankly, the pressure on governments, and certainly would have perhaps a significant potential of raising awareness and having some kind of impact. And now, it is also perhaps something to consider to attend, whether or not you have the resources to attend in Geneva, even in New York, United Nations events which touch on the human rights and justice situation in your South Asia country. It is very expensive. It can be a drain on resources, and you might be lucky to have a few minutes on the floor, especially in Geneva, in some of the forums to address, such as the UN Forum on Minorities, to address the gatherings there. But these international gatherings, like the UN Forum on Minority Issues and the UN Women's Forum, are extremely high profile. And I can tell you, the governments are not happy to be named and shamed in these global events. Whether this will help or not is something to consider thoughtfully and fully before engaging, because it is a serious investment in such a direction, But many organizations feel it is worth it, if only for the international visibility and awareness raising that it raises, and may result from it. Now, I know I don't have much time left, and I appreciate the chair's generosity. I'd just like to mention just very quickly two other areas which may not always be fully utilized. There are global civil organizations such as Article 18, which is focused on freedom of religion or belief, but I would also add Human Rights Watch and Minority Rights Group, which can provide a great deal of coverage, media coverage, attention, and can help organize events, including attending meetings at the United Nations in New York or Geneva, which is worthwhile to consider when looking forward to raising the visibility, awareness, and the impact, if you will, of your work involving religious minorities. They should be on your mailing list if they are not already. And once again, it may be important to, in terms of increasing visibility, awareness, and perhaps even increasing pressure on your governments to use the power and presence of these high-profile organizations, talk about what is happening to religious minorities with your governments, and cover this news much more in their own reports and publications. And if you can, again, this depends on your resources and priorities, continue working with those you are already engaged with. I think with IMRG, SARIM has quite a close relationship, but do try to reach out to the others also. Finally, there are now, and this has been become more common, there's a bit of a process in the last 10 or 15 years, a number of governments, of countries, who are more politically active specifically in the area of freedom of religion or belief. There is the International Religious Freedom or Belief Alliance, which now includes about 40 countries, some of which have actual ambassadors on freedom of religion or belief, which provide or can help provide targeted political, diplomatic influence and pressure on other governments who fail to respect their human rights obligations. There are a few issues with this organization, but it still has a high profile, and it may have a significant influence on governments in South Asia. It's worth the effort to consider how best to engage with the alliance and even attend some of its activities, some of which are open to civil society organizations. And finally, connected to this is that the United Kingdom is a member of this alliance, and it's worth looking into the possibilities of also engaging with that government because it has, as some of you may know, a special envoy for freedom of religion or belief, who is currently a British Member of Parliament, David Smith. His mandate covers freedom of religion or belief outside of the country, and of course, the situation in Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh in particular would possibly be of great interest. My time is absolutely up. Thank you once again for your generosity, and I'm at your disposal at any time if I can provide further assistance in any way. Merci, shukriya.
Thank you so much, Professor Varennes, for setting up such a high standard in terms of stronger messages. And your recommendations to these organizations are truly significant in terms of approaching and putting pressure on the governments who are not respecting the rights of the minority groups. I won't leave you without a question that I have in mind. Since you talk about the amalgamation of amalgamation of different rapporteurs who could provide recommendations to protect minorities, I also have, correct me if I'm wrong, since we do have a Human Rights Commission, how far are we to create Minority Rights Commission or perhaps Religious Minority Rights Commission? And after that,
at the United Nations.
Yeah.
At the United Nations.
Yeah, absolutely.
One can always raise this possibility, and I think at this stage we're still quite far. I would say the current international environment is not particularly generous. I won't say hostile, but I think there would be a lot of resistance from a number of member states to this eventuality. Let me put it that way. Thank you, Furqan.
Thank you so much, sir. Yeah, so once again, thank you so much for your generosity. I would, from Canada, would turn my focus to Brazil, where Professor Shah is patiently waiting, and I'm sorry, Professor Dr. Kishore, he had a commitment, so I would be requesting him, and after that, I would request you at the last, right? So since if we have any follow-up questions, then we can move forward. So Professor Shah, is a full law and geopolitical professor at the University of Maranhão. I would request you to shed a light on today's topic and perhaps pick where Dr. Fernand has left us.
Thank you very much, my dear friend Furqan Ahmed. Many thanks to all organizers of the SARIM, the Southeast Asia Research Center for Minorities. Many thanks for once again have the opportunity to learn from our dearest friend and professor, Fernand De Varennes. I'm very honored to share this moment with him and also with Sarah Gamita and Kishore, Professor Kishore. So we have been invited here to share some ideas regarding on human rights for religious minorities in South Asia, meaning protection, inclusion, and justice. So I'd like to approach the topic much aligned with Professor Fernand De Varennes just shared with us. So I'd like to propose a perspective on the reflecting regarding the aspect of weaponized law and fragile pluralism. So weaponization of the law is a consequence of discussing human rights of religious minorities in South Asia. So I would not much go deep further in the current situation in South Asia because Professor Fernand De Varennes, he has done a wonderful and irremarkable description. But South Asia is often described as a region where temples, mosques, churches, and gurdwaras and monasteries share the same streets. Nonetheless, the main comparative assessments of minority rights in the region converge on much darker landscape, meaning shrinking civic space, weak engagement with international human rights obligations, as just been shared by Professor Fernand De Varennes, and deeply entrenched patterns of discrimination and violence affecting religious and other minorities. But as we can just pick an information published 2 years ago, South Asia State of Minorities Reports notes that most states in the region perform poorly on ratifying and implementing core human rights treaties. And in consequence, it delays reports to treat bodies as rarely cooperate with the United Nations special procedures. Professor Ferdinand, he just made a very important remark, among all of the others, that the United Nations itself cannot force how human rights standards and levels of protections shall be actually experienced in local communities and in our societies. Of course, due to the international principles of international law, meaning the respect of the sovereign and no interference by the use of the force. But the combination of assertive religious nationalism, for example, together with discriminatory rhetoric and institutional passivity, has been extensively documented. So in South Asia State of Minority series, it has been identified, quote, spike in anti-minority targeting and rhetoric, with a particular impact on Muslims and Christians. So the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom in 2023 and last year asserted that there was a deterioration of religious freedom conditions with vigilance, violence, arbitrary arrests of religious leaders, and demolition of homes and places of worship, affecting, again, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, and others. So when we look locally, with all due respect to Furqan and all Pakistani society, in Pakistan, religious minorities such as Christians, Hindus, Ahmads, Shia Muslims live under the shadow of blasphemy provisions that carry the death penalty and are repeatedly misused. Now, if we look further east in Afghanistan, Taliban takeover in 2021 dismantled the existing human rights architecture, including the Human Rights Commission and institutions dedicated to women's rights, replacing them with bodies such as the Ministry for the Propagation of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice. Human Rights Watch reports, again, 2 years ago, portrayed the situation further deteriorated with a systematic exclusion of women and girls from secondary and higher education, severe restrictions on work and movement, repression of civil society, and ongoing attacks, particularly against the Shia Hazara community. Now, what could we actually do to push forward a network of protection, not only from the rhetoric approach and perspective, but taking together all of these sources do not describe isolated episodes. What they do, actually, they reveal legal political, and social environments in which religious minorities are repeatedly exposed to risk, with limited protection from the very institutions charged with upholding equality. So a specific cut, and then I approach my final share concerns, and for which I'm very honored and thankful to Furqan and all the members of the SARIM institution. So, as a specific cut, persistent violation through the weaponization of law and impunity, what can actually shall be done other than just talking about all of those violences? What could be done differently to diminish and overcome those violations? If protection, inclusion, and justice for religious minorities are to be taken seriously and not to reduce it to ceremonial language, several changes proposed in official and expert reports need to be treated as non-negotiable. But again, it's not easy because all of us, we agree that the law is an outcome of political choices. And again, due to the constraints of international law principles, much could not actually be implemented. But maybe we could try to constrain our local institutions. First, the legislation that demonstrably triggers and legitimizes violence requires substantive reform. For example, with all due respect for Pakistan, this means revising the content and application of blasphemy laws. It doesn't mean that you have to abolish them, but try to converge with the principles that are established, for example, in the International Convention of Political and Civil Rights, meaning narrowing their scope, introducing strong procedural safeguards, explicitly criminalizing false accusations, and ensuring that cases are handled by specialized units capable of resisting mob and political pressure, as recommended by the human rights bodies and the United Experts early 2022. If we talk about the perspective and the paysage in India, multiple assessments urge a critical re-examination of state-level anti-conversion statutes and of citizenship measures that have produced de facto religious hierarchies, with the aim of aligning domestic law with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and other obligations. Why? Because we have to push forward domestic coherence once these countries, they have subscribed these international treaties or pacta sunt servanda on international perspective. Secondly, we shall think and mobilize institutional guarantees which should and must move from symbolic existence to effective action. The South Asia Collective, for example, recommends strengthening national human rights institutions and minority commissions through secure mandates. As you, Furqan, just posed the questions to our honorable Professor Fernand De Varennes. Budgetary autonomy and investigative powers. So these elements, all of them together, can push forward and effectively grant the floor for an umbrella of interinstitutional measures and strategies to enforce effectively the respect for national religions, but also to understand the plethora, the mosaic, the pluralism of religions in the region, while ensuring their independence from executive interference. So the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority issue similarly emphasizes that such bodies should be able to receive complaints, identify structural patterns, and channel them to regional and international mechanisms when domestic remedies fail. And thirdly, persistent impunity for collective violence requires targeted responses. So as a prosecutor, as a legal scholar, as a geopolitics researcher, committed with the understand that there are a multi-level, interchangeable, and constrained variables coming from economy, discourse, psychosocial construction on the building of the constitutional subject, which we call it as national identity. Several reports recommend the creation of specialized hate crime investigation and prosecution units. This is important. You see, there is not only discrimination regarding religion in South Asia. We here in Brazil also face discrimination and prejudice. Public tracking systems for cases involving attacks on places of worship and minority neighborhoods, and explicit disciplinary or criminal responsibility for officials who, through deliberate inaction, allow predictable mob violence to proceed. So all of us, finally, we shall take into very strong consideration the political inclusion must be addressed head-on. The decline in minority representation in legislatures and local bodies weakens the capacity of these communities to influence school curricula, budget priorities, and security policies. So the South Asia Collective again proposes measures ranging from reserved seats and reform of electoral districts to changes in party rules to ensure that minority voices are present where decisions are made. And finally, for which I'm very honored and very grateful for this opportunity again, we shall push forward the regional framework, considering sometimes conspicuously absent and increasingly necessary. The South Asia State of Minority reports echo it, the UN actors, and both of them argue for the development of a South Asian charter and mechanism in human and minority rights that could set regional standards, provide early warning in the face of risk indicators, and moderate cross-border dynamics where a minority in one country is a majority in another one. So finally, these legal and institutional reforms will not sustain themselves without support of those who hold the line in difficult environments, as the very interesting role taken by the SARIM institution, meaning local organizations documenting violations, providing legal aid, promoting interfaith initiatives, and building everyday practices of coexistence, networks of women from minority communities, young mediators, and journalists tracking hate speech and violence. So many of these strategies shall be taken into account, and if not possible to pursue all of them, at least we can mobilize and try to implement one by one according to the social context and the political perspective, not only from the domestic perspective, but also to strengthen the domestic and international dialogue. So thank you very much, Furqan, for this opportunity to be with you again and to be with my dear Professor Fernand De Varennes, our friend from the RC26 Sagamitra, and to meet our dear Professor and Speaker, Vikrant Kishore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Shai, for bringing in such a comprehensive insight by providing your comparative analysis of different countries and different regions. As a prosecutor, you said it right, that as Dr. Fernand talked about the issue of implementation of law, you talked about the weaponization of law, so which is basically, I would say, contrasting difference in terms of the intention of the governments as well. I mean, I respectfully put forward a question before you, that where do you see that problem lies in terms of trust element by trusting your own legal organization? I'm saying, let's say, Brazilian Supreme Court, or I would say vice versa, like similarly in Pakistan and India. So why do we have to always knock the doors of like international government bodies in terms of raising the issues specifically with the minorities?
Of course, when courts are called upon to deliver, legally speaking, a social provision for a actual conflict, most of the time the courts themselves are criticized under the perspective of judicial activism. Nonetheless, in the state architecture of the sharing of legitimized powers, either the judicial branch, the executive branch, and the congressional, the legislative branch, three of them, they shall pursue their institutional responsibilities. So the judicial branch cannot deny an answer when a social conflict is presented before it. Of course, there are some institutional limitations on how to implement the decision itself. We have some historical incoherent examples, for instance, when we discuss from the constitutional theoretical perspective the case of Marbury versus Madison, when the United States Supreme Court granted the decision and recognized that that Marbury he had reason in pursuing the judicial favorable sentence. The president of the Supreme Court at that time, he recognized that the citizen had held the right, but due to the sharing of powers according to the constitutional architecture of the separation of powers, the judicial branch could not enforce the executive branch to do so. But it was 200 years ago. As a learning process, of course, we have learned that when the Supreme Court grants a decision, we shall implement it. And I can give you a very recent example of Brazil's Supreme Court regarding the imprisonment of the previous Republican president who committed a coup d'etat. So in this case here, we have learned that judicial decisions could not be constrained only to the rhetoric perspective. We have to leverage the public reasoning and understand that human dignity shall be protected by each and every democratic institution. And one thing is very, very interesting, and I give you my final remark if you allow me, is that either United States, either Brazil, either India or Pakistan, all of our countries, all of the four, they present itself as a democratic society. So we should push forward the meaning of what is the democracy understanding in respecting and protecting the human dignity and the human being. So I think if the society as a whole, we are at the same page, we shall take measures in compliance, integrity from our governance, either in Brazil, either in Pakistan. It doesn't matter, either in India, and I quote Gandhi, an injustice done here is an injustice done anywhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Shah, for responding to the very critical question with such a legal and an academic manner. So thank you for your generosity. So now I would request Dr. Vikrant Kishore, so I would turn my focus from Brazil to Australia, who has been patiently waiting for his turn. Dr. Vikrant Kishore is a filmmaker, academic author, and journalist from Australia who would bring unique and nuanced approach to today's discourse. Over to you, Dr. Kishore.
I'll just start with a basic introduction of mine. I'm Dr. Vikrant Kishore, and I come from Australia. Currently, I'm not in Australia. I'm in China. I'm in Shanghai. So I'm a professor at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, China, for a couple of years. So mostly operating from China, going back to Australia for holidays these days. And I participate in this discussion as a researcher, filmmaker, and educator whose work sits at the intersection of media, film culture, social justice, and minority representation across South Asia and its diasporas. My research has examined marginalized communities articulate identity, resistance, and dignity through media and how social hierarchies include. So I look at the concerns. My major concerns are themes that emerges from sustained engagement with communities, archives, and media practices rather than from purely legal or political lens. What has become increasingly evident in my work is the question of human rights, which are rarely experienced, and it is only through direct state action that we have heard Professor Fernand and Shai as well, and the state actions are very limited, and these are experienced through everyday practices, cultural norms, and media representations. So I'm just again restarting or reiterating some of the works. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to reflect on minority protection in South Asia by focusing on dignity, visibility, and social accountability, while also considering how these concerns travel into diaspora contexts such as Australia. And one of the questions is that why is it important to approach minority rights in South Asia through lived experience rather than only legal frameworks? And what I feel is that legal protections are foundational, but they often fail to capture how minorities experience vulnerability in everyday life. Many forms of discrimination are subtle, routine, and socially accepted, making them difficult to address through formal mechanisms alone. And these experiences may include exclusion from social network, unequal access to opportunities, or silencing through fear rather than coercion. So in South Asia, what we see, historical South Asian hierarchies have shaped everyday interactions long before modern legal systems emerged. And as a result, formal equality does not always translate into social equality. A lived experience perspective helps us understand how dignity is granted or withheld through daily interactions and not just through rights on paper. This approach also aligns human rights discourse more closely with community realities, making it less abstract and more accountable. So one of the another kind of issues is that how does media shape these visibility or invisibility of religious and social minorities in South Asia? And in fact, I find media to be a big problem these days, because if I'm seeing both in Pakistan and in India, or even if you talk about Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, media is somewhat amplifying hatred. These days, instead of media taking the side of, being an objective voice, somewhat it is becoming very, very participant in spreading these kind of hatred narrative, and also creating us versus them kind of narrative, which is very problematic. So media has always played a central role defining whose suffering is acknowledged and whose voices are marginalized. In many South Asian contexts, dominant narratives often normalize majoritarian perspectives, while framing minority experiences as peripheral or exceptional. Or even these days, it is not even acknowledged if there is a minority, okay? Like be it in Pakistan, Hindu minority rights or Christian minority rights, I've hardly seen things coming from there. Same in India, Muslim and other minorities, Buddhists, those stories don't come in, or those stories, and that lens is becoming very, very narrow, and the narrow of us versus them. The whole thing about the Muslim minorities in India to, keep on proving their national, the whole aspect of loyalty is another big question. But then those are also a big question about the geopolitical things, and not just only about minority. It is also related with the kind of tensions that all these neighboring countries have it with each other. So I'm not looking at those kind of country specific thing, which I think the previous two very well experienced people, scholars have already talked about it. Mine is more through the lens of how minorities are portrayed, spoken for, or reduced to symbolic figures rather than social actors. And this is what I'm concerned about, because this limits public understanding and weakens demand for justice today. So media therefore functions as both a site of exclusion and a potential space for assertion. Minority rights discussions must take media representation seriously, as visibility often precedes recognition. But what happens when media is itself compromised? The media is already in the hands of those people who are creating those narratives of us versus them, and not giving that kind of exposure to minority rights or the issues of minority in the way it should be done in a kind of a democratic setup. And that's what concerns us more, that how much democratic setup, a secular setup within a particular country, how those voices are being muzzled. And within that issue, my work is not looking at religion mostly, but it is looking at the religion divide within itself. So I talk about caste issues within various religions, be it Hinduism, how caste complicates things in Hinduism and creates otherization and marginalization, be it in Islam. In South Asian Muslims, caste operates, and it operates quite openly. In Sikhism, caste operates there quite a lot. Buddhism, again, caste is there. In Christianity, there is caste. So one thing is that while we talk about religious minorities, lots of times we overlook the complicated aspect of casteism within that. And minority discussions cannot be complete if we do not include caste, especially in South Asia. This is what I strongly feel, because it cuts across religious identities and shapes social power in a way that are often rendered invisible. While religion is commonly acknowledged in right frameworks, in particular rights frameworks, and caste-based exclusion is frequently treated as a social or cultural issue rather than a human rights concern. And this separation is misleading, because caste influences dignity, safety, and access to justice, often intensifying vulnerability for individuals already marked as minorities. Ignoring caste risks addressing symptoms rather than structures. And I'll give you our own example in Australia, that in 2021, I think, when the Australian Human Rights Commission wanted to broaden its anti-racism framework, it called for public submission as to how it can, broaden the anti-racism framework. And then few scholars and few activists from South Asian backgrounds, we all put in submissions to include caste within Australia's anti-racism framework. And then by 2024, with all these community discussions and consultations, in 2024, actually, Australian Human Rights Commissions accepted our particular policy, particular public policy submission. And Australia became the first that includes caste within its Australian Human Rights Commission's anti-racism framework. And that was a big thing for us. So by recognizing caste as a human rights issue, discussion on minority protection becomes more inclusive and better equipped to address overlapping forms of discrimination. So, and because we are talking about South Asians, and for me, living in Australia for more than 20 years now, for me, it's a very important thing that we also talk about diasporic context, okay? And that's where I bring a kind of a different lens here, that I talk about diaspora. So diasporic context reveals that social hierarchies are not confined to specific national settings. Migration relocates communities, but social structures often travel with them, adapting to new institutional environments. So this also brings certain religious stereotypes. Lots of people have friendship on the basis of the kind of religion you come from, or marginalize people on the basis of their religion back home, the kind of strife they are facing. Same thing goes with caste. The relationship that are formed in terms of caste is also very, very visible. In Australia, debates around caste discrimination demonstrates how deeply ingrained those hierarchies are. They appear in workplace, educational spaces, and community organizations, sometimes in ways that are less visible but equally harmful. So lots of times people think that until and unless there is a demonstrated violence against the religious minorities or against, those kind of castes which have been termed low castes, or which have been, religiously, in a way, they have been oppressed for thousands of years. Until and unless violence that appears in South Asia, if it does not replicate in the Western countries, then people think it is not, or rather South Asians want to ignore it. But they want to continue with their indirect discrimination. And that is much more harmful, because you're forming friendship, you're calling people to your parties, or you're ignoring people, or while you're also wanting the benefits of a Western liberal society by saying that we are discriminated on the basis of color, and then hiding that you also discriminate on the basis of religion or minorities or caste, very importantly. So those are very, very important discussions, that how South Asians, these are kind of extension of our homeland politics, but which is a very strong reminder that human rights challenges continue, and these challenges also require attention regardless of geography. So South Asians, wherever we go, we carry our religion, we carry our caste, we carry our cultural affiliation, and we also carry our stereotypes and the kind of biases that we have. So another kind of question is that, how can human rights discussion avoid becoming politically sensitive or nationally adversarial in South Asia? Okay, so this particular conversation actually risks become adversarial when they focus only on national comparison, that this is happening in Pakistan, that is happening in India, this is happening in Sri Lanka. But as Professor Fernand also talked about, a dignity-centered approach shifts emphasis from blame to responsibility, asking how systems can better protect vulnerable populations. And this approach encourages reflection rather than defensiveness. It also recognizes that no society is static, and that rights protection requires ongoing effort rather than moral positioning. Okay, there has been lots of moral positioning happening, but not action. And that's what in Australia, what we did was, when it came to caste, we have been focusing on those kind of action, policy framing. Okay, and as one of the earlier question was that how can, religious minority commission or something can be formed in UN. Same thing in a very, very small manner. We are taking the discussions on caste discrimination to small councils. We got Melbourne Council in Australia to include caste discrimination within its anti-racism and within its policy framework. Monash Council, it has done that. Same at state level, some of the activists and some of our friends, they were able to get it included within the Queensland state's work rights policies. And these are the ways that we can actually make tangible difference. And that is all about having a political sensitivity, also having continuous dialogue with policymakers, with people who have political, connections and political weightage, or constantly talking to them. Because lots of times what we have found in Australia, that South Asian cultural baggage, religious baggage caste issues, they are not able to see it, because what they have been able to see is through the lens of racism, or even if it is about religion, then it is through a very Western lens, but not those kind of sensitivities and problematics that South Asia comes with, and also the nation division that also does that. So I'll just take 2 more minutes. And lots of times I've been asked that what role can cultural and creative practices play in strengthening minority dignity and inclusion? I've talked about media a bit. So cultural expressions offers minorities ways to assert presence, memory, and agency where formal mechanisms fall short. And this was one of our discussions with Australian Human Rights Commission. They said that, when we are talking about caste or these kind of hatred that is indirect, we don't see those stories coming. And then we thought, how do we get people to come about and talk about those stories? Because what happens with minorities, it's a very big deal to come out from those trauma and to share the trauma of being, marginalized, being traumatized, facing those kind of historical exclusion, which is very problematic, and identifying themselves as someone coming from a minority status or coming from an outcast status is a very big deal. But we started, asking people, and we actually went out and got lots of, testimonies, and that really helps to actually show people, demonstrate that yes, and then through media, through films, through performance, communities can articulate lived realities that may otherwise remain unheard. In fact, my latest documentary, it's on caste in Australia. This documentary I just screened back in Melbourne about in November. I screened on 1st November in a conference, and then on 3rd November in a symposium. And that is the first kind of a documentary where I got people from the caste oppressed communities to come and share their views. But I also had to use my own take, my own personal experiences in Australia to talk about it. And that gives a kind of a solid platform for people from either you replicate it for minority communities or people who are religiously persecuted because of their religion. All those problems are there, and that needs to be talked about. And not gatekeeping. Gatekeeping is a problem. And because of this gatekeeping, we also find what kind of entrepreneurship, leadership through social media storytelling, through people, individuals taking those kind of stands on these platforms, which are more democratic than those kind of traditional media, which really are gatekeeping what kind of voices are there. So these kind of discussions becomes very important to come in out there. So creative practices to tell out, stories, to enable dialogue, to enable recognition, to enable empathy. These are the essential component of justice. Only when you are able to, share these, justice might be possible. So creative practice should not be seen as complementary to legal or policy intervention, but should be seen. Actually, it should be seen and not peripheral to them. So we should also create as much of media and kind of projects or talks, record it, put it online, and see what kind of difference it makes. And finally, I've got lots of things to talk about. So, but I always find a dignity-focused framework reorients human rights away from legal minimums towards everyday respect. It asks whether minorities can live without fear, exclusion, or silence. And, for me, minority protection is not just about defending nations, tradition, or reputations. It is about ensuring that dignity, safety, and justice remains central to social life. And South Asia's diversity offers both challenges and possibilities. And how we respond to minority vulnerability will and should define the ethical direction of the region and its diaspora. And with that, I end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Kishore, for portraying such a unique camouflage on the issues of minorities. And the moment I saw your profile and done a bit of research on your work, and we do share some commonality in terms of our work. I happen to work with media development organization. You talk about the visibility and invisibility of those communities who are deprived of their rights and who are at the receiving end. I mean, I do have a follow-up question. I mean, our colleague Dr. Sanya Mitra also comes from a background who shares similar background in terms of lived experience. So, I mean, in sensitizing media, do we still need to live in that shell to educate media on how to portray communities who are already at the receiving end in terms of capacity building? Because I happen to work on a project called Gender Equality Reporting, which is GER, where we taught journalists on how to even call somebody with their profession, like if it's a lady doctor, you're not supposed to call it a lady doctor. You're supposed to call a doctor is a doctor, right? And there's another famous cliche which talks about female lawyer. A lawyer is a lawyer. You cannot just discriminate those professions with their genders. So how would you take up that question in terms of, do we still need to sensitize media in this digital age?
Absolutely. Sensitization of media is the most important, because media is always being, it is always being played in the hands of, of the majority. And media represents that. And that is a problem across all over the world. You call it how, in the Western worlds, we are seeing the kind of control of right-wing media and those kind of narratives that is being played, and how people are also demonized because of the access to media. Similarly, back in South Asia, media is being misused in that way to otherize people. And even if you're not otherizing people, if you invisibilize them, okay, invisibilization, that you do not talk about it, you do not acknowledge it, you do not even, say that they exist. Now, what is the worst crime than anything? The invisibilization of any people, be it religious minorities or be it caste oppressed people. And in terms of media, I have seen that firsthand. I started as a journalist. I worked in India, in my starting of my career. I was a correspondent for Z News. Unfortunately, I do not share the views and things what Z News is doing now. I used to be there with them 20 years back. And I hate those kind of media where they have a very kind of specific agenda. And I've been there, and I still see media in different ways. I teach media, I teach journalism, I make films. Okay, so I do understand. And what I see is that the minority voices are not there. They are just a handful of people. So building allyship matters. Making them aware matters. In fact, just last month, on 3rd of November, I did a big symposium which was titled Understanding Caste Discrimination in Diaspora, Building Dialogues and Allyship. So my focus was not about understanding caste, but it was about building dialogues and allyship. I was wanting that people from different religion, different community, from different backgrounds should come and talk to us and understand, rather than we keep on talking, this is a problem, this is a problem. This has been a problem for thousands of years. People are being persecuted, they are demonized, they are invisibilized, they are, different kinds of discrimination are in the action. But how do we get people informed, made aware, and also bring them on the table to have a dialogue, to make them understand, and also build that allyship, which is a very important thing. Of course, lots of people might disagree that the fight of minorities or fight of the dispossessed and discriminated belongs to them, and till the time they don't stand up, they won't go anywhere. But then I totally disagree with that. Of course, that fight, we have to take that fight. And that's where the discussion is, that when allies come, they have to come in as supporters and not take those platforms which belongs to the dispossessed, the marginalized. And that's what that has been in South Asia. The privileged castes and privileged community always, in a way, found way to usurp those kind of roles, and they became the kind of the guiding light. They became, the so-called whitewashing, that if you have to talk about the Dalit rights, or if you have to talk about, the Muslim minorities in India, you need to have a Brahmin or some other, privileged community person to come and talk about it. And that is questionable, and that is problematic. That is not allyship sometimes. And of course, what I'm talking about, it needs much more explanation rather than just 2-3 lines. And of course, I'm not also insinuating any specific community or caste in this. This is just an example of privileged positions and underprivileged positions. So that has to be kept in mind.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kishore. We do have a question from Dr. Sangamitra, and after the words, we would move on to a closing session. And thank you so much for responding to that question very briefly.
Yeah. Good afternoon, Professor, and it's nice to hear you. A lot of insight I got from your talk. So if we see the South Asia and all the religious communities, suppose in case of India, the Hindus are majority and other communities are minority, and in case of Sri Lanka, the Buddhists are majority and other Islam and Hindus are minority there, and in case of Pakistan, Pakistan is Muslims are majority and other religious community are minority. So here, how do you bring here we can come to the things that if majority religion is there, then other communities are getting suppressed by that the majoritarian religious community or the category, we can say. So in case of India, when we are talking about the Hinduism and the caste system, you rightly pointed out and you told there are a lot of laws regarding to safeguard the rights of the Dalits and the marginalized communities. But when in the implementational level, those who are sitting again in the law implementation, they are coming from the privileged category. So how do you interpret, and how such kind of problem people can, like, not people, how such kind of problem can be sorted out? So can you give some insight about it? And can you explain again also in regard to South Asia, when the different religion, majoritarian religion occupying space, and in the same again, like that same religion in another country becoming minority, but they are facing also trouble. So can you expand this thought, please? Thank you.
Yeah. So I started my discussion, when I talked about this particular aspect, I already set that particular theme that I'm talking in terms of my focus being on dignity, visibility, and social accountability. And that is the most important thing, that, while there might be legal protections which are foundational, but then they might be failing to capture how minorities experience these particular protections in everyday life, because majority, how does the majority treat its minority? And that is where the main crux lies. The responsibility of the majority is most important. They have to make sure the minority doesn't feel that way. It's not about any religion. And no religion, in a way, according to people who practice, or even in terms of religious, basic texts, all religions always talk about, some kind of equality and brotherhood and all. Of course, when it comes to Hinduism, that could be a questionable, because it talks about a graded system of inequality as well within that, okay, which in Islam you don't find it. But when it operates in India, or when it operates in South Asia, because it has such a huge history, the graded inequality is there in all the religions, okay. And this is what I was talking about caste, that we are talking about religion, but hey, let's wait a minute, let's talk about caste, because that is bringing the graded inequality, as Dr. B.R. Ambedkar talked about, and this graded inequality is a problem. And that is where I talk about the South Asia. You change any religion, make them majority, the graded inequality remains there. Someone is going to look down upon a certain caste, a certain community. They might be violent towards a religion because the religious violence has another kind of history. But also in India and in Pakistan, these kind of religious persecution is also to do with the history of the division between India and Pakistan, okay? Being, an Islamic state and so-called secular state, which opened its arms to, all kinds of religion, but still Muslims were minority because they were of, the numbers, in terms of numbers we talk about. Okay, and lots of times these days people, there are different people who have a different talk, and the right wings will say, hey, Muslims are no more minority. They are already 20 crores of Muslims in India, so why should we talk about them as minorities? But then that is again a problem, because you are not looking at the weight or the kind of power a majority can exert, and how it can marginalize a minority. And that's what we are seeing, and I was talking about media demonization or media invisibilization. And this is what happens then when you talk about someone or you do not talk about anyone. Okay, if you look at Hindi cinema, Hindi cinema 1970s was such a kind of a time where Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Isai, that kind of brotherhood you used to see. The hero or the second lead, either there used to be Hindu or Muslim, or the brotherhood would reign supreme. These days, it's hard to find those kind of films. These days, you look at the media, the kind of films that are coming out, it's all about those kind of hatred or violence and propaganda films. Propaganda films have become so much prominent in India. I don't know about Pakistan because I'm not too much into Pakistani films, or I don't watch it. But whatever I've watched it, even I watched the last Pakistani film, which was War, which was itself a propaganda film, which had Indians being demonized in it in a way. And so we laughed. In fact, I did a screening for the Pakistani community in Newcastle, back in Australia, and I got this film for the Pakistani community. And I was laughing when I was watching it because it was demonizing India, and I being from Indian origin, organizing something and watching it. But then at the end, everybody was having fun, because we all know what Indian cinema does to Muslims and what Pakistani cinema ended up doing to Indians there. But anyway, that brotherhood, that kind of understanding is essential, that through our own kind of differences, are we able to respect each other? Are we able to safeguard that dignity towards each other? And that is the basic thing people are requiring. That is what we are talking about. Like you said, that the Constitution already guarantees those things for, especially the oppressed communities, oppressed caste in India, which is a very, very strong thing. But what is happening is that through certain dilution of certain policies, through, not addressing those kind of rights, or not making it accessible to people, that's where the problem keeps on, it stays there because you are not trying to address it. You have it on paper, but it is not happening. It is not reaching to the people, and that is where the problem is. Those things need to be talked about. That's why the aspect of information, awareness, education, bringing it close to them, and allyship, be it with other religions, be it with other castes, those things are very important. And at the end of the day, a humanist value and kind of humane thinking for each other, everything needs to come from a very, very kind of a being human kind of a approach, that we all are human, we all are one. Why should we discriminate, or why should we look at someone's color, why should we look at someone's caste, or why should we look, even if I'm a very religious person, why should I question someone else's religion or their practices, or even food habit? Food habit becomes such a strong point of religious divisions. They eat meat, we don't eat meat, we are vegetarian, they are vegetarian. In some other countries, vegetarians will be mocked upon. In India, the non-vegetarians would be mocked upon. Marriages happen because or marriages break because someone is non-vegetarian or someone is vegetarian. Those are the kind of things, and these are the human kind of own created discriminatory things. But these have taken very, very strong lines, which is making people not change. And our problem, and why we are talking today about human dignity, for me, it's important that we should be able to bring change through our work, through our films, through our music, through our song, through our dance, through our policies, through our kind of papers, through our discussions that we are doing today, to tell people that we have to empathize towards each other. We have to be sympathetic. We have to give prominence to the term dignity. You cannot make someone, strip them of their dignity, and you can revel in that. You cannot enjoy that. And if you're enjoying that, then you can't call yourself human. And for me, that is the problem. We are dealing with inhuman people. And if these inhuman people are there, we need to make sure that somewhere those kind of talks that we are doing reaches out to people. And at policy level, we make changes. But at grassroots levels, we are always working towards achieving that social reform that we want to do. It has been happening for last thousands of years, and it will continue to happen for another thousands of years. It's not going to happen immediately, but we have to continuously work. So at that I end. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vikrant, for those powerful words. And it's a reminder that we do need to dignify the dignity, right? We do need to understand the common problems. We do need to address them, right? So on this very note, there's another need to design a program on understanding the definition of minority. I mean, what numbers should be sufficient to be called upon as a minority, right? So we will take another time to perhaps organize a session on the definition of minorities. So as we approach on today's very insightful discourse, we are reminded that human rights frameworks must translate into lived guarantees. The dignity and security of religious minorities are not optional. They are not an abstract also. They are basically the areas of policy. They are central test of the democratic credibility. Today's discourse is therefore an essential step towards aligning South Asia's pluralistic ideals with enforceable human rights practices. And on this note, I would like to provide my gratitude to all the esteemed scholars who joined, who enlightened us with their valuable insights and comprehensive discourse. So, and I also thank you, Dr. Sangamitra, for being there throughout this session. Dr. Vikrant, once again, grateful to you, and very generous approach. You also remain throughout this program. Other guests have prior commitments, so they said sorry to you that they have to give you, hit the nail in the coffin, final nail in the coffin of discrimination. So thank you so much.